That's right, Mac.
I got to tweet that out later, that's all, I'm sorry. How's it going, everybody?
That sounds a little weak.
Happy to be here. Oh, look at all these beautiful people here. So we're here to learn about the new face of venture and how venture's changing, right? So, this panel is going to be a little different than what we've had so far today. Just in my own personal opinion, right? Y'all can tell me if I'm wrong afterwards. If I do a bad job, don't tweet about it, just come talk to me afterwards. I got an image to uphold, Mac the VC is like a cool thing on Twitter. But, we got quite a large panel today, so we're going to kick it off a little different. I'm not going to ask everybody to give their backgrounds because all of y'all are extremely impressive. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask you to tell everybody your name and the thesis of your fund. Start with you.
I'm Atif Hawan, Indus Valley Capital. We are a Pakistan-focused fund, which is one of the most underserved markets up until very recently.
Lolita Taub, thanks so much, everyone, for being here. And I'm investing in pre-seed and seed community-driven companies.
Maria Salamanca. I invest in immigrant founders at a fund called Unshackled Ventures.
Henri Pierre-Jacques, Harlem Capital, pre-seed seed, Black Latino women founders, US, Africa, and LATAM.
Jillian Williams, Cowboy Ventures. We're a seed stage venture fund, but I focus on, we're generalists, but I focus on fintech.
And I'm your moderator today, Matt Conwell from Rare Breed Ventures. We do pre-seed to seed companies outside the major tech hubs here in the United States, North America, South America, and Europe, right? And so, as you heard from everybody here, the kind of companies we're talking about and investing in sounds a lot different than what you might have heard a decade ago, right? Like, very different. Femtech should have been a thing since forever, and now it's like a buzzword, it's a hot thing, but why is that new, right? Investing in underrepresented founders, even when Harlem Capital got started in 2015, it wasn't a cool thing. It just became a cool thing, right? And then Pakistan, oh my God, wow. I feel like I'm behind. I'm trying to do a deal with everybody here, right? So understanding that, I have an important question for all of you, right? As the new faces of venture, starting a venture firm is really hard. Fighting against the grain is even harder. And when you're trying to start a firm and fight against the grain, it's kind of hard to explain that to LPs. So I went, and all of you all had amazing jobs, amazing careers. Why would you leave what you were doing to do this? And so we're going to start on the other side of the panel this time around.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, I focus specifically on fintech, and I think for me, the way I thought about it was I was in banking before, and honestly, it was 2015, 2016, and I was at Barclays, and honestly, they didn't even know what Venmo was. We were sitting in a room, and they, a lot of the partners, MDs, asked if anyone in the room knew what that was. Literally no one sitting at the table, which meant all the senior people looked around. Everybody else raised their hand. And so it was one of those light bulbs that went off of my head that I was like, all right, they are not forward-looking whatsoever. And so it was one of those things where I was like, I really just want to be chatting with people who are actually thinking about the future. I think venture, especially 10 years ago, was a lot more generalist. And I think you could do a great job in venture while being really good at seeing kind of everything and not necessarily having a niche. And I think for me, and as I was thinking about my venture career, I really thought about it in a way where, let's say, I kind of stumbled into fintech, but then became really excited about it and just what the opportunities were in the space and how massive it could be and how much and how rapidly it was changing in the US, but also globally. And so for me, it was if I can be really, really good at understanding this one sector, which then also bleeds into all these other sectors. I mean, it's kind of a meme now that everything is becoming fintech, but it is true that a lot of other sectors are intersecting. I think I wanted that to be kind of my niche and where I was focused. And so I think for me, I really focused on kind of being and developing this network within the fintech space and creating an identity within that. And so I think that was kind of part of my transition into the venture space.
Yeah, similar. So I did traditional finance, banking, private equity before venture capital. I had been the only one, like my whole life, right? Like AP classes in high school, only black person, 45-person banking group, only black person. And in private equity, I was at ICV, which is a firm actually now here in Miami as well. And it's a black-owned firm. And Willie Woods, the founder, like just really empowered, and Jared, my partner, he was my coworker in private equity. It was the first time we both worked for black people. And so when we started angel investing with our own money on the side, we were like, well, if we're gonna invest, we wanna invest in our communities. So we actually didn't know like diversity was a problem for venture, because none of us worked in venture. We just started angel investing. We were seeing really good black Latino women founders. And then once we went to Harvard Business School, we were roommates. And so we both started recruiting. So we actually went to school not thinking we were gonna raise a fund. And we started recruiting, and after you work for a black-owned firm, I was like, I can't work for a firm with no black partners. I need at least one, and which was, there were like 10 firms in 2017 that had black partners where they actually like were real partners, like they ran the firm. And so that kind of went away, and so I was like, Jared, we were in our kitchen, which was our office in our apartment, and I was like, hey, we're both recruiting. Like, I don't really want to work for any of these non-black firms. Like, I'm kind of past that point in my life. I'm tired of that. Why don't we just like raise a fund? We'd been angel investing for 2 years. We'd put about $250,000 between 6 of us into like 15 companies. And he was hesitant. So I said, okay, so I applied for a fellowship, got the fellowship. Jared didn't get his top choice, which was KKR. And I said, hey, I got this fellowship. Like, why don't you just join it? My wife lives in New York. His wife lives in New York. We don't have to pay for rent. Like, let's just fundraise and see what happens. If it doesn't work, we can come back to campus in the fall and just recruit anyway. And so I convinced them, and then, we kind of raised the fund, and that's what happened. But really, I would say the biggest trigger was like, one, we had, like, you can't be what you can't see. So we had somebody of color who was managing $1.3 billion, right? So it's like, oh, like I can see somebody black who manages $1 billion plus, like so that inspired us. And then two, once we went to actually go recruit, like we want to work for people of color, and we want to invest in people of color, pre-George Floyd, like there just weren't many firms. And there weren't many firms who can afford Harvard Business School students. I wasn't about to make no money. And so it kind of was like, well, we got to start our own firm because nobody's doing what we want to do.
I actually come from a little bit of a different background. I'm more in the political, so I studied political science at Berkeley, and after and during Berkeley time, I worked in campaigns. I started a lobbying group that, I didn't know I was starting a lobbying group, but it turned out it's what Swing Left is today. And I think for me, ever since I was really young, I was very attracted to where the sources of like macro power lied. And I think I grew up in Florida. I'm from Orlando originally. Well, I was born in Colombia. And came to the US when I was 7, grew up in Orlando. And I think as an immigrant myself, I mean, it took my family and I 10, 12 years to become citizens. And I was like, at that time, from that perspective, I was like, power is held in Washington. It's held in policymakers, it's held in politicians. And I went to Berkeley thinking, I want to go to law school, I want to be kind of that big macro change. At some point, I saw many things that were broken. And then being in Berkeley, I mean, it was impossible to not see tech and venture. And I was like, wait a minute, there's this other source of massive power. And after spending time in politics and campaigns and public policy, I was like, this just moves really slow, man. And then like, even by the time like you elect someone, it takes them 2 years to hire people and then another 2 years to kind of do something. And I was like, this is not, like, I like the macro effects, but it's very slow. And tech was kind of the opposite to that, right? It is, I mean, at the time, like Facebook was one of my like early internships, and it was this whole move fast, break things. And I was very aware of how that could go wrong, but I was also very aware of how much upside that had for people that were, like, I didn't want to wait for change. I felt that if people like me were in power, I could give founders that power as well to then not wait for change themselves. And so this fund that I landed on was a very natural fit. It was a fund that was just getting started. I met the 2 founding partners, and they had just closed the first $5 million of the first fund. And they were like, we want to be the first check and the first bet in immigrant entrepreneurs. And we know that this country is built on immigrants, and they over-index on entrepreneurship. When you look at unicorn companies, Fortune 500 CEOs. It's always, any given year, 40 to 50% of these companies are run by immigrants. So we know that immigrants are definitely not 40 to 50% of this country, or God forbid what Trump would do. And it really is. It's a scary, right? Like it's a population that over-indexes. And so for me, it was such an obvious bet. Like, wow, I'm going to be the first check on immigrant entrepreneurs. Many of them who don't have family and friends around. Many of them who don't have the networks to raise from. And I get to be that person. I was like, there's so much upside and potential, not just on like really good people, but like financial upside. And that's kind of what we do. We try to be that first check. There's obviously like a great upside from that.
I did not know all the public sector stuff, but I actually so I actually also wanted to change the world through public sector, and then I quickly realized I was moving too slow. And then went into commercial tech, and I realized, wow, there's a lot of great stuff, and my background's actually in sales, so making money has always been my MO. And then I found out that you can go even faster than the corporations I was working for, IBM, Cisco. And I discovered this opportunity that was being missed, which is really underestimated founders, which I got to invest in through Backstage and in different vehicles. But really the story goes like, I didn't know this world existed at all. My parents came from Mexico. And now it's funny because I live in Mexico and I'm exploring how to achieve alpha, and we will do it. But my parents immigrated from Mexico from a small farm to give their future kids an opportunity. First home was a garage. Sometimes we didn't have enough food, and community was the people that kept us alive. Food, shelter, safety. I grew up in the streets of South Central LA, so Bloods, Crips are straight out of Compton. Like, that is how I grew up. Some people don't believe it, but fact check, it's true. But I learned the importance of community back then, and as I was evolving in my career as a sales professional, selling to SMBs, to enterprise, whatever, and then tying it back to the opportunity that existed in making money, I noticed there's this big gap of great founders that were being overlooked, not getting funding. When I say underestimated, I think oftentimes we pass on the definition of what that is. And what I mean by that is not underrepresented, not there isn't 50% female and whatever, It's all about there are people out there who have the talent, but not the opportunity. And we all here have access to those people, and we can invest on better terms, and we can all make more money off of it. And so there's that tactical like business opportunity part, for sure, that brought me into VC. But from a hero's journey perspective, I think we're always on a journey of like, what do we want to be when we grow up, and what's the meaning of our life? When I step back and think about what do I want to do and how do I want to make impact, similar to Maria, who said, there is so much power in venture capital and the capital markets. You could do public sector, nonprofit, all of them are needed. But when you know that you can be at the table betting on what's going to be the future, the solutions for our future, and you get to work with super awesome, smart people, bet with them, grow with them, make money with them. That's like the best thing. And then you get to be a nerd all the time. I love learning. So I am like literally like, Henry was literally making fun of me because I was on my computer like working. I love this stuff. And it is a humbling career because you don't know it all, although you may all think that, some people say they do, but we don't know. We are all making it up as we go along, right? And we all have to continuously be learning. And I love that aspect too. So curious and just learning about what's going on. I mean, just think about Web3, which by the way is just a really great rebrand of what was happening in 2017, but don't tell anyone. Anyway, I think when you think about why you get into VC, there is this, what is the skill set? What is your interest? What's your passion? So it keeps you driving because it is really hard. But then on the flip side, you really got to know, like, what's your thesis and how you're going to make money, because that's the business.
So there is this definition of hell that I find really fascinating, which is, at your last moments, thinking about the difference between what you could have done and what you ended up doing. And that's, in essence, unrealized potential. And that's the reason I'm doing this. It's very mission-led for me. And personally, for me, I'm an immigrant, born and raised in Pakistan. What that meant was you move to where the opportunity is. So I came to the US, spent 15 years here in this country, has been incredible to me. I got to start my career at Microsoft, ended up leading growth and international efforts for LinkedIn over 7 years. And then in 2018, when I took some time off after LinkedIn, I spent a fair bit of that in Pakistan. And what I saw was there is this country of 220 million people, very young. Median Pakistani is not even a millennial. Median Pakistani is a Gen Z, so full of potential. And guess how much in venture capital Pakistan was getting a year? It was averaging under $10 million. So 5 cents per capita. And that made 0 sense, because on the ground, everything was there. Now Pakistan has 109 million broadband subscribers. So people are connected. They're using Facebook, WhatsApp, TikTok. They're connected. There's $250 billion in consumer spending, which, by the way, was exactly similar to what Indonesia was in 2009. And it didn't make any sense. And I felt that, another VC job in the US, I've been angel investing here, or like another growth or product job didn't cut it. So decided to move back, started Indus Valley Capital. And it's fascinating, like that opportunity was a matter of shining the light on it. 7 months after our first investment check in Airlift, first round capital, one of the leading stage, early VCs, ends up leading their Series A, and they had not invested in Asia for over a decade. And that was just an incredible validation, and then things took on from there. And what we're seeing is that this year, Pakistani startup ecosystem already has raised more than $300 million in venture capital. I think it's going to be hitting $1 billion a year pretty soon, so that's pretty exciting, but still super early days.
And so for me, my background's completely different from all of y'all. Being from Baltimore, I did the one thing that every self-respecting young black person in Baltimore would do, is I dropped out of a local HBCU my junior year and got a job at the National Security Agency with a top secret clearance to be a software engineer. Yes. Spent several years doing that, and then decided I was going to start a startup. I didn't even know what a startup was. I didn't know what a VC was. I just said, I'm going to build a website so I can make money while I slept. That turned into a 4-year journey of a company that I sold, and then started another company. That one failed. And then somehow I found my way into venture, working for a firm that only invested in companies in the state of Maryland. I'm from Baltimore. I love Maryland. That was great for me. But the reason why I started my firm is I met an entrepreneur, this young woman who had this great idea, and I couldn't find a way to back her. And nobody I was introducing to her would back her. And so she decided to become a surrogate mother to raise the money to start building her prototype. I thought that was crazy. And I told myself in that moment, I never wanted to see a founder as amazing as her have to go through all that. And for context, she had an engineering degree from Morgan State University. She had a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University, and she was a patent examiner. She's an engineer. She built stuff. And nobody could see the opportunity that she was trying to present. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll raise a fund so I could back her. 2 years later, I did that, and I gave her her first check, right? Like, that's what it means to be a new face in venture. Like, if you hear this, it's a 3-point. We all saw these issues of change we wanted to make happen. And we saw that the access and careers that we had gave us the ability to push that change forward. And that's really what the new faces of venture really is. But then, there's all these new things popping up, right? People are talking about rolling funds, solo capitalists, operating investors. I would love to have a conversation with all of you. Like, how do you view that? How do you think that all these new things are going to affect the way venture is going to be in the future, right? Like, it's not the same 5 firms anymore. There's a whole lot of new firms coming up. There are a lot of firms that were just coming up a decade ago that are now large franchises. And so there's this new wave of us who are trying to be there, So what do you see with all these new structures and new strategies? I mean, people are using 506C. People are raising their funds off of Twitter. Do you think this is a good thing? Do you think that this is going to help the community? Like, where do you all see this going?
I just have to comment on this because maybe some of you actually even participated in this poll, but I asked about how do you founders feel about taking money from a Sequoia, from one of the Greylock or whatnot that have raised massive funds for pre-seed seed, right? Because that's the other thing that's happening, these big multi-stage coming to pre-seed where we're operating a lot of the time. Are they going to kick us out of our game? Or family offices that are also now playing direct investments? How do we stay relevant, or are we? What's our edge? And in this poll, I really asked, like, who do you take money from? Big name brand or an emerging fund manager that cares and is actually going to be there? Because if you have billions in AUM and you have thousands of companies, with the exception of 500 startups, because I know they're really awesome, it's really hard to give the love and attention. And we all know some very famous accelerators that if you're not doing too good, you don't get any love. And so what the poll actually said was that founders actually would prefer to go with some of us, get people who care and who understand what they're solving for, and that we're going to be there for them versus taking the big name. And I think that says so much to me. It means there's a space for all of us to play, but there's also what's happening in the founder perspective, like, what do I want and who do I want to make money for? And I'm hearing that more and more, and it's about power to the people, being community driven, bringing us all in.
Yeah, I think I think from the LP perspective, there's a lot of question marks. You have a lot of new faces coming, like solo GPs, small up-and-coming micro funds, and the LP base changes within, right? Usually your first fund, if any of you were to get started, tends to be very wealthy individuals who take that first bet on you as well. Maybe you go a little bit bigger, you get family offices, maybe you get some very specific to your vertical or your focus, right? So we have a couple of family offices that care very deeply about immigrants. But once you start getting into institutional capital, right, this comes around Fund 3, Fund 4, which is when you have to start talking to the endowments, to the pension funds, to where the big dollars are. And these are the funds that are in the Sequoias, the Andreessens, the Greylocks of the world. I think that's where it gets tough. I think that's where my big question is on the scalability of many of the new experiments. And I think it's fantastic for founders for there to be a lot of new funds. I think for them to have options is great, and I think the smaller funds and upcoming, and I think the new phase of venture capital has more hustle than many of the very existing established players. And so for founders, I think it's fantastic. I think from the manager's perspective, when you look at these LPs, I mean, Sequoia and Andreessen are going to them and asking for money faster, more often, and bigger checks. And so these LPs are either, and they're already over allocated in venture capital in their asset portfolio, which means that many of them have to make the tough choice of not having new managers, or just decreasing the amount of managers they do have in venture and over allocating to the big funds, because Sequoia is no longer in 3-4 year investment cycles. They're now in, every 18 months they're coming back. And so at that point, they do, in a way, suck out the oxygen for the rest of us. And I think that's a bigger question to be answered at the LP level.
Unless we look elsewhere and broader, just saying.
No, I agree. No, I agree. But I think, on that part of the institutional capital world, there is not the, I guess, maybe innovation and sophistication that we see at venture, which I'm sure, Harlan probably has some good takes here on your LP base and how you see the ecosystem emerging.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think you need more innovation. I think it's definitely easier at the earlier stages. I think a later stage, when you want to get 100 million plus, you just got to raise big checks. Otherwise, it's really hard. I think one point when we were in the back, we probably have 150 to 200 companies between the six of us. At least Harlem Capital doesn't have one co-investment with any other firm on the stage. And so I think, and I remember when we raised our first fund, back then, really Backstage was like one of the only funds. And we were going to meetings, and the first question was like, how are you different from Backstage? And I think the assumption is that because all of us are people of color, like we are co-investing, like we're not, I don't compete with any of them on the stage for our deals. Like we're all looking at different deals, and LPs have to get that out of their head. I'm like, so there can't be 2 black funds in the entire country? Like they're in Like they're in California, and there's probably like 5 white funds in the same building, in the same block in San Francisco that are tech-focused and they're SaaS-focused funds. So I think that's a problem as well. I think a lot of LPs think like diversity-focused funds or underrepresented-focused funds are the same, and so it's similar to when I was the only person in banking or the only person in whatever. It's like you're competing. Like I can't have 2 diverse focused firms, or I can't have 2, underrepresented focused firms because I'm not getting different exposure, but like you're not asking these same questions. When I was in business school, there were 3 of us who raised funds my year. We were the only fund that actually raised. The other 2, their dads gave them $25 million. And like one of their theses was technology will change the world. This is in 2019, right? And it's just like mind-boggling to me. But like for our thesis, oftentimes they're like, but what's your thesis? Like, what do you focus on? We're like, we're focused on diverse founders. Like, but like, what sector? It's like, no, this is the thesis. It's 3% of funding. Like, show me an industry where 3% of funding goes to it. Fintech, biotech, e-commerce. Like, these are 30, 40% of capital going to it, and you're telling me you're a specialist when you're 40% of the capital in the market. Like, this is not possible. Right, and nowadays that's kind of changing too. Like you can't be a fintech investor; it doesn't mean anything anymore. Like what are you actually specializing in? And so I think the LPs have to really change the language of how they approach diverse managers and stop, 1, putting us against each other, and 2, recognize that like there are new theses. You don't have to have like industry-focused verticals to be specialists in the market.
Also, we do not invest in social impact just because we're people of color.
And so I want to address something that Maria brought up. For this new wave of managers who are building in public, they're 506c, they're doing the rolling fund, using Twitter and all that. It does make it democratizes access and makes it easier to raise a fund 1, right? You can raise a sub $50 million fund that way, right? But your point about as you get bigger, and you have to go to different type of LPs, and I think that's where the rubber meets the road for this, right? We're making it easier for people to break into venture. But this is still a scoreboard-driven industry. At the end of the day, everybody's going to point to the scoreboard and be like, yo, so what do your returns look like? And when you're going from fund 1 to fund 2, it's going to be, what do your markups look like? What's your MOIC? What's your TVPI? I don't really care about IRR. That's just a function of time and all that. Like, get that out of here. Let's talk about actual money being made or money on paper. And so one thing I think for anybody in the audience who is an emerging manager or looking to raise a fund, like, yes, you can raise a fund 1 today, but our job at the end of the day is to return capital to our LPs. And so if you are in a position where you're raising, you gotta be looking to put points on the board. So like at Rare Breed, like everybody tells me how great it was that I raised off of Twitter. That's awesome. But my job is to find amazing companies. And as long as I'm focused on that, my portfolio over time is going to net out that when I do go to those large institutions and they benchmark me against the vintage, I stand out. And like, that's still the job. It's not like raising a fund is great. It's just like having a company say, hey, we raised a round. That's great. That's not the goal, right? It's the starting point. The goal is investing in amazing companies, hitting those unicorn, decacorns, and going larger, and getting to that DPI where you're returning significant capital to your LPs. Like, it was funny, we were having, we were talking to Marlon from Mac Ventures yesterday, and he said, hey, when you're a top 5% fund, things change. That's when Harvard calls you. Well, anybody can become a top 5% fund. You just got to do the work and find the founders. It's a lot easier to raise the money, but you still got to be out there competing. So that's really where I think it is.
But also, I think it's a lot. I think one of the dynamics is actually first-time funds usually actually outperform. Emerging managers actually have really, really great returns, and there's a few different dynamics of that. One is typically the smaller funds, so they are easier to return, and also you don't have the same restraints and constraints in terms of check sizes, ownership. So you can be kind of that friendly VC where I just need to get a small check in. You don't have to be the one leading the deal. And so you're not as competitive. You can get into really great deals. You can work really closely with founders. That gets harder as you continue to grow, as you need to get that ownership to really return that fund. And so I think that kind of goes to Maria's point, that as you continue to grow, that then you need more capital, and then it kind of, you really have to prove your point that you are a great investor. You're able to really back, not only just like choose the right winners, but also get them to choose you over other funds as well. It's a lot easier to say, I can get a $250K check into this $5 million round versus, no, I'm getting the $3 million of the $5 million and you're choosing me as your lead. And I think that continues to get harder and harder as there are larger funds and the market gets more competitive as well. And so I think that kind of goes to your point as you think about how can we really create those returns, and just thinking about portfolio construction and how that becomes more important, because it's not just about purely picking the winners, but then making sure that the winners are really returning the fund in the way that you need as well.
And so I'm gonna push back on that. So I agree that's the way venture's been done. But I also think that's like the way that everybody tells us venture needs to be done. But I firmly believe there are other models that can get you to that significant return without having to play that game that way.
That's
And
not
Charles is a great example of this, right? He's like, I want to stay at 50 million.
But that's
No,
the-
stay. I think you can stay at that. Oh, absolutely. But I'm saying it's still. But then he's modeling his returns to 50 million. I completely agree with that. I'm saying that if you decide to get bigger, then your portfolio construction has to change, because you have to think about how you're returning your fund.
Yeah.
And so then you do have to get more competitive.
We're about to get
In
spicy
this
now.
market, I mean, in this
We're like, let's get in
market,
it.
if you're modeling a Series A company, or you're a Series A fund, let's say benchmark the best so you can think of, like, I mean, I don't know, Mac, what kind of math you got to do to now have ownership and return that fund?
So
You got to have ownership.
Yeah.
I am currently in, I'm gonna say this out loud. This is the first time I've ever said this. I'm actually putting together a model to show how you can have a pre-seed to seed, a $250 million pre-seed to seed fund, and still be able to do a combination of smaller checks and larger checks in a larger portfolio.
Right,
It still can be
that's like, I mean, that's the YC model, right? You put a lot of small checks in like, you either play the volume game or you play this concentrated game.
I think there's something in the middle. I'm out to prove something different.
There is another aspect
Told you
of
this
this.
spicy.
There is another
Oh, see
aspect of
it.
this too.
Right.
I think there are multiple paths to success here, and at some point, if you want to go and be really big, yes, you have to get more ownership. But where you are playing, and I feel, I feel very optimistic that people, on the stage here, some of you are going to go and raise these amazing funds because today you're playing a different game, which means you're accessing opportunities that actually Sequoia doesn't. If Sequoia wants to invest in Pakistan, they will have to figure out, does it go to Southeast Asia or Sequoia India or something? If one of you wants to come in, you'll move like this. And that's what we saw. Harry Stebbings, Josh Buckley, they've invested in Pakistan. And they moved so quickly. These deals happen in a few weeks. Some of the large funds are going to miss out on that. And that's not just international. Even within that, I think some of the community-led stuff, Web3, if you look at Initialized Fund 1, it's an incredible fund. When Gary and Alexis started, they got into these deals that were available to everyone, but the big institutions didn't see the world the same way. And I think that's the strength of this group.
100%. I mean, I think the place where new faces win is on pure hustle. And then it's on going really fast. I will say that what makes Sequoia is that Sequoia moves really fast. I mean, I don't think Sequoia has ever lost that hustle. And I think that's what, they stay humble. They move in 1 or 2 days if they need to, which I think they're probably one of the big funds that continues to still turn things, like they operate like they are a very micro new VC fund. Which is impressive for them. But I agree that when you look at everyone else and then the new up-and-coming funds, like the biggest gap is, we work on weekends, we work on holidays. We were talking about this the other day, like, what is a long weekend means no meetings, but it's a lot of good work that gets done.
I think there's actually different levers that we can pull when we're looking at the model. Venture capital is still very young, and there's different things that we can all get creative on. And since we come from different perspectives, we're going to eventually approach it differently. The traditional has been raise bigger funds, bigger checks, bigger ownership, et cetera. But there's all these different things that we have heard about, rolling funds, things like that. There's another spectrum that Atif is talking to, right? Looking outside. Currently, I'm investing in North America and LATAM, but when you think about, like, LATAM has 600 million people in population, 2 times US, right? You look at the $6 trillion market, and you do see some of the big guys going in there, but who are they backing? Same profile, cookie cutter, Silicon Valley profiles. And so there's so much opportunity to be sought out in these emerging markets. And so that's one lever. How you build the actual portfolio construction in a model, how the world actually plays out, all these different levers, and then there's things that we can control and we cannot. But I think ultimately what makes the most sense, I mean, I'll tell you one more thing, because I invested in Syndicate, and Syndicate is all about basically a crypto club to invest. You're decentralizing, making DAOs, right? You're owning the whole investment as a group and then investing together. That's a whole different way of approaching. So I believe that there's going to be more and more creativity in how we go into investing in startups, and it's up to us to stay like in the forefront and leverage our unique insights in making capital. I don't think there's one way, and I think also it's very personal to each of us how we are able to really leverage what our strengths are, our access to deal flow, and how we go through the whole funnel.
And so I'll put that out there to be spicy, but I only say that honestly to say, when you learn about venture and talk about venture, you're given a playbook of this is how venture's done. And I want to constantly push the community to think differently. Like, are there other ways to get to those outsized returns, but in different models? I don't want anybody here to be locked into this is how venture is done, because that's BS. Venture essentially is still a very young industry. And it's a young industry with a very long, it's a long cycle between, you know, when you start a fund and you close a fund. And so the feedback loop is so much longer than the feedback loops we have for these startups that we work with. But even knowing that, I don't want anybody to stop pushing the envelope. Even if people tell you you're wrong or you're crazy, it doesn't matter, right? That's how we get to the next big thing.
Prove us wrong, Mac.
I'm working on it. I'm telling you.
I want the math.
I'm working on it. But we're coming up on
Very
time.
curious. Share it on WhatsApp.
I'll get it out to
He's going to tweet it.
Honestly, I actually am. I'm going to write a whole Medium article about it, so be on the lookout. But before we end this, you know, as the new faces of venture, as folks who are raising funds and doing things differently, what's one piece of advice you would give to yourself when you were just starting out? What's one piece of advice of something you know now that you would tell to yourself back then? We'll start with Henri.
I would say, like, it's okay to not know everything. I think so many people are flying the plane while it's being built. Like, we say it all the time internally. And it's just really true. I think I really, you know, when you start out, you're kind of scared of the Sequoias and all the big funds. But you start talking to the bigger funds or the smaller funds, you just realize like some of them got really lucky. Some of them still don't have like processes like built, like they're using Google Drive. I knew firms that had like billions of AUM that were using Google Drive and had like no back end. And it was just shocking to me. And I think, you know, that really just like, it kind of to some extent like gives you the freedom to just be more okay with like not knowing it. And that, I think, is just really powerful. I think a lot of people in venture and tech and the Twitter world, like, they're just BSing half the time. And you just have to kind of know, like, hey, like, you know, it's okay, like, for me to not know, and I'll figure it out. And I think particularly as people of color, particularly as women or underrepresented people, you know, a lot of studies have been proving about this, like, where you feel like you need to be able to check off more of the requirements to be in those positions versus if there's 10 checklists, like, no, like you can have 3 of the 10, and like that's a lot of people in this industry, and that's okay, and you can learn the 7 while you're actually in the industry.
I think my advice would be both with kind of your co-investors and with your founders that it's okay to lose out on good deals that you just didn't see. Like, I think coming to terms with, look, fantastic deal, might be a unicorn, I'm okay with not working with that founder. I don't think I would have liked working with that founder. I don't think that founder would have been great in my portfolio. I think that takes a lot of time, but like learning to say no and have confidence on, look, I'm going to focus on this. I'm going to stay focused, and I'm not going to live off the FOMO. And I mean, this industry it's big. There's a lot of money. The multiples keep getting bigger. There is a lot of space for many of us to win. And staying focused is probably the hardest thing, and even more so in these markets when everyone is incredibly indisciplined. that I think that would be my advice. Just like it's okay to say no to things that might be big.
Mine is just very general advice. I think at the beginning of getting to know something new, you always want to follow the rules. This is an industry to break the rules because we are in venture capital and we're about risk. High risk, high reward.
So I would tell my earlier self that the world is more changeable than you think. So you have to keep pushing harder and really go for the big things. And the context is, initially I wasn't sure if we'd be able to get the top US-based funds to invest in Pakistan, a market that nobody had heard. But once it started playing out, like everybody's interested, like Tiger is looking, SoftBank is looking. It's just crazy what's possible. And same advice to all of you as well. It's our imagination that limits us more than the world itself.
I think I would just say, maybe to the opposite of Maria, is also trusting your gut. There's a lot of noise out there, and people can kind of convince you that something that you're looking at is not interesting, and just knowing, if you have conviction in something, following that.
And for me, what I would have told myself is, you're good enough. Don't give in to the imposter syndrome. Don't think that you can't, because you can. And everybody here can. That's it.
Ooh.